The second round of the French presidential election took place in the weeks between races. The first round had taken place a week before the Imola race, with Lionel Jospin for the Socialist Party topping the polls on just over 7 million votes, because the incumbent Rally pour la République (RPR) was split between two candidates, current Prime Minister Edouard Balladur and Mayor of Paris and former PM Jacques Chirac. Chirac won that particular contest and went forward to the second round, where he defeated Jospin in a closer election than many were expecting. Balladur resigned as Prime Minister in the wake of his unsuccessful run for President, so the newly elected President Chirac would have a clean slate to work with, and Foreign Minister Alain Juppé was appointed instead. There were elections too in the UK, where the incumbent Conservative government suffered a thumping in the local government elections. By the close of polls, a mere 6 local councils remained under Tory control, with none at all in Scotland or Wales, while the Labour opposition under new leader Tony Blair now controlled 155 and the Liberal Democrats 45. Comparisons were difficult though, as the country was in the middle of a reform of local government which had redrawn borders and created many new councils. The third season of the English Premier League ended with a new champion, last year's runners-up Blackburn Rovers, who'd last won the top division of English football in 1913-14. Despite losing 2-1 to manager Kenny Dalglish's old club Liverpool on the last day, Manchester United, missing star striker Eric Cantona of course, could only manage a 1-1 draw against West Ham. A couple of weeks later, United would also fall at the final hurdle in the FA Cup final when they lost to Everton. At the other end of the table, it had been decided to reduce the size of the league from 22 to 20, so 4 teams were relegated: Crystal Palace, Norwich, Leicester and Ipswich, who'd famously lost 9-0 to Manchester United in March, with just 2 being promoted, Middlesbrough and Bolton Wanderers. On the Saturday of race weekend, the 40th anniversary Eurovision Song Contest was held back at the Point Theatre in Dublin, the third time in a row it had been held in Ireland, a record that still stands. Irish state broadcaster RTE, being desperate to lose the contest and avoid the cost of hosting again, had become something of a running joke, and finally their wishes were granted as Eddie Friel's song Dreamin', second in the running order, a place from which no one has ever won Eurovision, trailed in 14th. Secret Garden, representing Norway, but with Irish vocalist and violinist Fionnuala Sherry front and centre, won the contest, so it kept it in the family at least. Perennial runners-up the UK tried something new by entering the hip-hop track Love City Groove, but having to perform it with an orchestral backing didn't do it any favours and it came in 10th, though it did well enough in the UK chart, peaking at number 7. And in American football, the NFL approved the move of the LA Rams to St. Louis for the 1996 season, leaving Los Angeles without a team in the championship after the move of the Raiders to Oakland from 1995. The Rams weren't actually native to California either, having been formed as the Cleveland Rams in 1936, then moved out west in 1946 to make way for the newly founded Cleveland Browns. Barcelona was holding its biannual motor show, Automobile Barcelona, in Grand Prix week, so there were a lot of top brass around at the race. Renault CEO Louis Schweitzer was there to announce the launch later in the year of a new estate version of flagship saloon the Laguna, which had just taken its first win in the British Touring Car Championship at Thruxton for the Williams-Renault team, with Alain Menu at the wheel. Obviously, Monsieur Schweitzer was hoping either Williams or Benetton would do the diamond proud in Spain, but there were also rumours that the highly paid brand ambassador Alain Prost was starting to get a bit bored of champagne and finger food and was considering launching his own F1 team ready for 1997, in which case could he count on Renault support? Schweitzer said that Renault had a policy of supplying no more than 2 teams, so at least for now the answer was no. Over in the Jordan Peugeot motorhome, they were playing host to Jacques Calvet, CEO of Peugeot Sport Automobile. Calvet had never been much of an F1 fan, and this was actually his first Grand Prix, so Eddie Jordan laid out the green carpet, presenting him with a bottle of finest Irish whiskey, before the boss spent some time with the engineers, taking a professional interest in the developments and problems they'd been encountering, a visit which by all accounts immensely cheered up the team, who'd been feeling a bit downcast after a pretty bad start to the season, just 1 finish and no points so far. But there were tensions too, with Rubens Barrichello in particular under fire for subpar performances, as he struggled to get the hang of left foot braking and just 2 pedals rather than the 3 he was used to. He'd also let slip that he was already in talks with other teams for 1996, including Ferrari, which didn't go down well with his boss either. Ferrari had their paymasters in town too, with Cesare Romiti and Paolo Cantarella of Fiat there to celebrate their Punto being voted Car of the Year for the Barcelona show, and of course there was a strong presence from the various divisions of Elf, still on a big publicity offensive after the damaging Elf affair, all of whom might as well not have been there as far as the world's media are concerned, because Flavio Briatore had arranged for Czech supermodel Eva Herzegovina to visit the Benetton pit for a photo shoot with Schumacher and the rest. The Benettons were also sporting bright orange rear wing end plates thanks to a decidedly less glamorous sponsorship deal with Flymo. Michael hadn't had a great start to the season himself, to be honest. The new Benetton was proving tricky to master, even for him, and after his win in Brazil there'd been a series of errors, spins and problems that had allowed Damon Hill to seize the initiative. But he dismissed talk of a crisis and had trained hard in preparation for Barcelona. Over on the other side of the garage, when he wasn't lending Eva his car, Johnny Herbert was having it even worse. 4th place in Argentina, representing his only points of the year so far, and he'd run into the problem previously encountered by Messrs Verstappen, Leto, Patrese and Brundle before him, that being Schumacher's teammate was to be the third driver in a 2-car team. Even his own engineers weren't able to make the changes he asked for to his own car, and his technical debriefs were just, "Anything to add, Johnny?" after Michael had said his piece. One of his predecessors was back in the paddock in Spain, though, as Martin Brundle took up his seat at Ligier after having had to sit out the first 3 races working for the BBC. In fact, he'd proved quite popular as Murray Walker's co-commentator, and some suggested that when he finally did hang up the helmet, he'd made quite a good audition to go into it full time. Anyway, he was back with Ligier, as was Guy Ligier himself, who seemed to have remembered after his PR visit to Imola that he actually quite enjoyed being in the paddock, and was back alongside his old friend and former driver Jacques Lafitte, freshly minted ambassador for Ligier Sports, as the team put on a charm offensive aimed at the French media, with René Arnoux, Jean-Pierre Jarier and Philippe Alliot all dropping in too, while Erics, Bernard and Comas were around looking for a drive, and the former on co-coms for French Eurosport, and Ligier's test driver, Frank Lagorce, in an even more unenviable position than Johnny Herbert, was also quietly seeking other options. Last year's Spanish Grand Prix had, in the aftermath of the accidents at Imola and then Carl Wendlinger's smash in Monaco, sprouted an ugly and unpopular tyre chicane at the tricky Nissan right-left flick, and for this year the corner had simply been removed entirely, tightening turn 9, Campsa, slightly, and making it now a straight run down from there to La Caixa, now turn 10 instead of turn 11. Other than that, and a bigger run-off error at the final turn where Andrea Montemini had come a cropper last year, the circuit was as it had been and was well known as a popular testing venue. Even Taki Inoue, who was suffering not least from never having driven any of these circuits before, had done this one during his single season of F3000. Speaking of Wendlinger, it had become increasingly obvious in the first 3 races of the season that the Austrian really hadn't recovered properly from his big accident. Physically he was fine, but he'd clearly lost a step mentally, just lacking confidence and being far too conservative in braking for turns. Loyalty is a fine thing, but Peter Sauber needed results, and once more it seemed that Carl would be put back on the proverbial bench for a while after Spain, so there might be a Sauber seat in the offing for one of those unemployed drivers to aim at, with Sauber test driver Norberto Fontana still probably just a bit too young. There were some developments in the cars between races, with the B195 re-engineered a bit internally to make it easier to drive, new diffusers on the Benetton, Jordan and Ligier, and new radiators taking 8 kilos off the very porky 40 chassis. Schumacher set his stall out early on Friday morning's warm-up in a wet-dry session, and then they all went out to qualify. Mimo Schiattarella, incidentally, appeared to be wearing one of Roberto Moreno's lids when he spun about 15 minutes into the session, but I can't find any further information on that. Presumably he borrowed it for some reason. But when Friday's session ended, it was Alesi and Berger who topped the times, with Coulthard third, Schumacher fourth, just over 4 tenths off the top, and Hill fifth, 8 tenths behind the German. But as the track got faster on Saturday, everyone improved, not least Schumacher, who'd got his settings perfectly dialed in and went round nearly 2 seconds quicker than Alesi's provisional pole time on Friday to take his 8th career pole, with Jean lining up alongside him, 6 tenths behind, and Berger once more so close, just 19 thousandths off his teammate, with Coulthard pipping Hill to 4th by a similar margin. Irvine, 6th, was then 1.1 seconds behind Hill, and the last man within 2 seconds of Schumacher. Herbert was 7th alongside Barrichello, while the McLarens were all over the place, lining up on row 5 after simultaneously suffering oversteer and understeer. Brundle showed Ligier what they'd been missing out on by qualifying 11th and a good half second quicker than Panis, down in 15th, followed by Frentzen 12th, finding no grip in the Sauber. Sarlo might have done better than 13th if his Yamaha hadn't detonated on Saturday. Verstappen was decent again in 16th amid rumours that Simtek were still in real financial trouble, and the ever-improving Inoue was 18th. Wendlinger was a disappointed 20th, sandwiched between the two Minardis, with Schiattarella, the two Pacifics and the two 40s bringing up the rear. Sunday morning's warm-up saw a decent turnout by Spain's standards, with 53,000 in the stands, bolstered by German and British holidaymakers and a sizable French contingent under sunny skies. Lisa Dennis headed into the Eurosport studio to say how chipper everyone was despite the setback so far.
The feeling in the team, although we haven't had the results we want, is very upbeat this year, very positive. Nigel's fitted in well, he's been in a good humour. Mika's always a positive, upbeat driver. So I think it's looking quite good.
But while she was talking, Mansell had gone out for his warm-up and come back into the garage absolutely fuming and described to his mechanics, Lisa's husband Ron, and a couple of visitors how his piece of junk of a car was completely undrivable before departing in high dudgeon. The visitors, Helmut Werner, the president of Mercedes, and Jürgen Schremp, who was about to take over as chairman of the board of the entire Daimler-Benz group, rounded on Ron Dennis and said in essence he's got to go.
As an ex-world champion and an Indy champion, do you find the situation that you're in discouraging?
Well, I mean, I use the word disappointing, really. I mean, everybody knows that my motivation was to try come back and compete at the highest level, and through no fault of anybody's, we all thought that was going to be in the Williams car, which is the pick of the bunch at the moment in the pit lane. They didn't get things quite right today, but for sure tomorrow they'll be competitive. But I mean, you know, I think McLaren thought they'll be more competitive than they are, and you know, it's a set of circumstances we all find ourselves in, and there's an awful lot of hard work to do. I mean, you know, there's no magic in this business. It's just, you know, complete engineering, and you've got to get it right, and when you get it wrong, then it hurts.
25 cars lined up for the start, with Montemini's Pacific suffering a hydraulics failure in the gearbox department, and they were ready to go. Thanks to a technical glitch, the green light didn't come on, but everyone just went as soon as the reds went out anyway, with Schumacher sprinting into the lead, chased by a lazy, with Hill leaping ahead of Berger to nab third, and Coulthard getting away slowly and dropping behind both Irvine and Häkkinen. Behind David were Herbert, Barrichello and Frentzen, with Mansell dropping back. He was 14th by the end of lap 2 as Schumacher stretched his lead, 1.6 seconds ahead of Alesi and 3 ahead of Hill. By the end of the next lap it was 2.8 seconds back to Alesi and 4.6 back to Hill, while Coulthard had got back ahead of Häkkinen and Mansell had dropped another place, this time to Panis. So whatever had been ailing Schumacher and Benetton so far seemed to have been fixed, at least for now, as the German was lapping a full second faster than anyone else at the moment. Hill was speeding up too, closing to within shouting distance of Alesi, who was trying to conserve his tyres, and Mansell had seemingly got his car under him a bit more and had shaken off Katayama's pursuit of him and retaken 14th from Panis. Coulthard was in hot pursuit of Irvine, having a look just as the cameras cut away to show a replay of Moreno spinning, but fortunately nothing was missed as he wasn't able to get through. Next time round, though, he was close enough to make it stick. Hill was now the meat in a Ferrari sandwich as Berger had pulled up behind him, but the Ferraris had been fairly eating their tyres all weekend, so neither of them was going flat out so far, which was frustrating for Hill, who clearly wanted to get past Alesi and off in pursuit of the ever more distant Schumacher, who lapped both the 40s on lap 11. 2 laps later, and still unable to get past the Ferrari, Hill dove in for his first stop of 3. Williams were running 3 stops, while Benetton and Ferrari were both planning for 2. Hill was back on track in 9th and hoping that he'd be able to quickly catch back up. Next time around, Coulthard was in turn, rejoining just behind Damon. Coulthard's stop had been nearly 3 seconds quicker than Hill's, which raised the question of if they were on different strategies, putting in different amounts of fuel, or if there'd just been some slight problem with Hill's stop. Mansell was in for his first stop on lap 16 to see if a new set of boots would help his understeer, and next time round it was Berger's turn, which promoted Häkkinen to third until he too came in. Yet more fuel nozzle problems kept Mika standing for 11 seconds, while out on track and unhappy Mansell, now running 18th, was lapped by race leader Michael Schumacher. Herbert made his first stop, in from third and out ahead of Häkkinen and the Jordans with whom he'd been fighting, as Mansell had an excursion into the gravel, and decided on lap 20 to pack it in as a bad job and drove into the garage to retire. Next time round, Schumacher was in for his first stop and rejoined the race still with a 7.4 second lead over Alesi, who was stuck a little behind Brundle, but also suffering an oil leak somewhere in the engine, which turned into an explosive blowout on the main straight at the end of lap 25, the first retirement of the season for Ferrari, not that that would make Alesi feel any better about it. He pulled over and parked it in the hatched area between the track and the pit lane and stalked off as Mansell talked to the BBC and was clearly unimpressed.
Nigel, bad luck. Can you tell us what happened?
I don't think it was bad luck, Tony. This is a question. I let Michael through. I was having handling problems anyway, and then I tried to turn in the corner behind Michael, and the car just went straight on, and I was suffering a little bit the lap before. I get to the next corner, I put the car on full lock to turn left, the car just went straight on. Oh, we don't know, we're checking the tyre pressures now, and the front wing and the underneath, but I mean, we can't drive like that.
Any problems before that, Nigel?
Well, I mean, the car was inconsistent and understeer to oversteer. So at least you could get round the corner, but when you turn into a corner and the car doesn't want to turn, that's the problem.
Thanks, Nigel.
Released from behind Alesi, Hill immediately set fastest lap as he charged in pursuit of Schumacher with a 9.8 second gap to overcome. Just over halfway, though, he needed to make his second stop of 3, which went well but still dropped him to 4th behind Coulthard and Berger, though he did advance a place when his teammate came in next time around. He was only just behind Berger, though, right on the Ferrari's rear wing. As Hakkinen made another stop, Hill was jinking this way and that, looking for an opening, but before he tried anything, Berger stuck his hand out of the cockpit and dived into the pits, presumably remembering Patrese' colossal accident in 1991, where he hit the back of Berger after not realising the Austrian was pitting. All of which elevated Herbert to 3rd place and closing a 2-second gap to Hill, who now had a 36-second deficit on Schumacher, with both of them having one stop yet to make. Berger, meanwhile, was now 5th and had Hakkinen right on his heels, but got a bit of a breather by putting Katayama between them for half a lap or so. Herbert came in for his second of 2 stops, but thanks to a communications mix-up he shot off with the rear jack still attached, as rear jack man Steve Matcham flailed helplessly after it. Fortunately for all concerned, though, it fell off of its own accord just before he exited the pit lane, and the marshals could repatriate it to the Benetton pit where it was past fit for use, which was just as well as Schumacher was in 2 laps later, and after a great stop, Matcham got the jack away cleanly, if a bit deliberately. The gap to the lead was down to 6 seconds with 20 laps left, but Hill would need to do one more pit stop before the end, so it looked like he was going to have to resign himself to 2nd place unless something happened to Schumacher. Just as Tony Jardine caught up with Steve Matcham, Bertrand Gachot pulled over at the end of the pit lane. He'd come in for fuel and a stuck hose had left drops igniting on the bodywork around the filler cap as he left, so he'd been advised to park it up just to be safe. In fact, the fire marshals were having a busy time of it because Taki Inoue had just pulled in with his Hart engine on fire too, both minor incidents fortunately. Hakkinen was the first to make a 3rd stop, and then it was Hill's turn, followed the next lap by Coulthard, who had been briefly 2nd. Berger was there now, but again he was in shortly afterwards, so once everyone had stopped, the order with 13 laps to go was Schumacher leading Hill by 25 seconds, with Coulthard 3rd, then Herbert, Berger and Irvine the top 6, and the last men unlapped, with Hakkinen and Barrichello in pursuit. Hakkinen was charging after Coulthard and a podium place. Herbert was charging after Coulthard and a podium place, while his old Lotus teammate Hakkinen pulled in with a problem with his fuel system. Not a great race for McLaren, all told. And then Coulthard was pulling off, his gearbox having self-destructed while lapping Frentzen, which promoted Herbert to 3rd, with Berger in 4th and 15 seconds behind Johnny, then the Jordans in 5th and 6th, but Olivier Panis in 7th was gaining on 6th place Barrichello, who was suffering from a sticky throttle. With just a few laps to go, Katayama's engine decided that enough was enough, when the Japanese driver was running 12th, while his teammate Salo was 10th and had Michael Schumacher bearing down on him, with 5th placed Irvine behind him, but a lap down. Schumacher began his last lap a dominant 25 seconds ahead of Hill, and cruised round, metaphorically with one elbow out of the cockpit, to take the win. But then there was chaos, as the electronic timing graphics showed Herbert finishing 2nd and Berger 3rd, but the TV pictures were just showing Schumacher and Benetton celebrating, so commentators around the world had no idea what was going on. Finally, the pictures showed Hill rolling across the line in fourth. He'd lost both throttle and gearbox in the first corner of the last lap and had to do the whole thing stuck in fifth gear and with his engine ticking over. He wasn't the only one having late problems either. Barrichello's throttle finally gave up, forcing the unhappy Brazilian to cede the last point to Olivier Panis, his and the Ligier team's first points of the year, with Irvine taking fifth. So a delighted Johnny Herbert stepped onto the podium for the first time in his F1 career, with Gerhard Berger an equally surprised and delighted third. He was really making that bottom step of the podium his own in '95, this being his third visit there in 4 races. Johnny Herbert later told journalists that he'd almost forgotten what champagne tasted like. The last time I must have had some was after my victory at Le Mans in 1991. I'm happy to be here because, as you know, last year with Lotus I nearly gave it all up, abandoned everything, which just goes to show. In fact, Herbert's memory was faulty. He hadn't made it to the podium at Le Mans because he was suffering from dehydration. The last time he'd actually tasted podium champagne was for third place in 1988 at the F3000 race in Monza, 2 races before his colossal accident at Brands Hatch. It was also Benetton's second ever 1-2 finish, the first having been Piquet and Moreno benefiting from Prost and Senna's collision at Suzuka in 1990. Whatever had ailed them in the last couple of races seemed to have been definitively fixed, and Herbert had shown that if given half a chance he did have the chops to race well, which would help his case within the team. That evening, Nigel Mansell decided that he'd do the next few races, arrive at Silverstone and announce his retirement with immediate effect to his adoring fans. But Jürgen Schrempp, the new Daimler-Benz president who'd been shocked by Mansell's outburst in the garage this morning, informed both Ron Dennis and Monsieur Ogier that he was taking an executive decision to fire Nigel effective immediately. Ron and Mansour didn't object, and sponsors Marlboro were kept out of the loop until it was all done, which they were decidedly unhappy about. It came at the end of a difficult week for Mercedes because over in the US it was the first week of practice and time trials for the Indy 500, and it had been a catastrophe for the firm, with both Penske drivers Emerson Fittipaldi and Alonso Jr. failing to qualify, while the highest placed Mercedes engine car on the grid was Bobby Rahal's car in 21st. So perhaps there was less patience with Mansell than there might otherwise have been. But as yet no announcement had been made, so as far as everyone outside McLaren knew, Nigel would be driving in Monaco in 2 weeks' time.
When the sun shines down